Next we'll have Elise Giuliano, who will be talking about Could It Happen Here? How to Think About Ethnic Conflict in Ukraine.
I just want to thank PONARS for existing. I'm happy to be part of such a vibrant intellectual community. I want to thank Marlon for somewhat of a last-minute invitation to present. Could Ukraine become another site where, like in Bosnia, citizens of different ethnicities who have lived together peaceably for decades suddenly turn against each other? Has the crisis in Ukraine politicized ethnic identity so that ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians form polarized political camps? Well, no. But these questions may not be as superfluous as they initially sound. It's a positive that despite the recent political crisis and violence, Ukraine has managed to avoid ethnic violence. No ethnic Russian political entrepreneurs or ethnic parties have appeared, despite the formation of the separatist DNR and LNR, despite Russia's media propaganda, and despite Putin's comments in 2014 about the need to protect ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in Novorossiya. Most ordinary Ukrainian citizens ignored that project and the ethnic boundary it was meant to reify. On the other side, another positive. Popular support for radical Ukrainian ethnic nationalists is very low, as indicated in results of parliamentary elections. However, the existence of Ukrainian nationalist parties and far-right paramilitary groups may represent a danger, especially if other political leaders use these groups for their own short-term political purposes. For example, some analysts are predicting that President Poroshenko will try to bolster his abysmal approval rating by promoting a more ethnically exclusivist set of policies in order to ally with the powerful Ministry of Internal Affairs led by Avakov, which controls the far-right Azov battalion. In my talk today, I'll outline a few facts about identity in Ukraine that make ethnic conflict unlikely, and then I'll discuss some developments that nevertheless raise the possibility that ethnicity is becoming increasingly politicized in post-Maidan Ukraine. First, I want to make the point that ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians do not form separate, self-enclosed groups separated by a bright boundary. First, as we know, cultural differences between Russians and Ukrainians are quite low in terms of religion, language, shared history, and social and cultural practices. Most importantly, people do not perceive cultural differences to matter, which establishes the expectation among them that cultural difference cannot serve as the basis of interethnic conflict. Next, mixed identity or hybrid identities are very common, especially in the South and East. The Donetsk region, for example, had the highest number of Ukrainian-Russian families at the end of the Soviet period, 42%. So what does hybrid identity mean for self-identification? Well, there are several alternatives. It could mean nothing. Individuals may identify either as Russian or Ukrainian, or it could mean that individuals identify as both groups simultaneously, rendering an ethnic boundary meaningless, or it could mean that individuals reject ethnicity as an identity category altogether. Here's an example of the latter from the field research that I did in the eastern region of Kharkiv this summer. One middle-aged man said, identity, I don't know, probably Ukrainian, but it's all mixed up. So many people have lived here historically that it's all melted together. A pure nation doesn't really exist anywhere in the world. So this is good news. Non-essentialist understandings of ethnic identity are clearly not fertile ground for ethnic entrepreneurs who want to reify ethnic boundaries. Next, identity shift. Scholars have been noting since Ukraine acquired independence that identity there has been shifting away from ethnicity as a salient personal identity to a broader identity, such as national identity. And now, since the Ukraine crisis, there's even more of a trend of people who consider themselves ethnic Russians choosing to identify only with national identity, i.e. as Ukrainians. Volodya Kulik's surveys bear this out. Another example from my field research, these are comments from focus groups. I was born in Kazakhstan, there were only Kazakhs and Russians. When I came here to Ukraine, I was also some kind of Russian. And in my passport, I was Russian. Then, when Ukraine acquired independence in '91, I didn't think about it. But later, I gradually began to consider myself Ukrainian. And after 2014, when Russians became more annoying, I identify myself as a Ukrainian. On the one hand, an increase in identification with Ukrainian national identity in the wake of the Ukraine crisis is a very positive development for Ukraine. However, as we know, civic or national identities are not totally devoid of ethnic content, though Americans often conceive them to be. And there is concern that following Maidan, the Ukrainian civic or national identity is evolving in a direction that incorporates certain beliefs and attitudes that in the past were associated with an ethno-national understanding of the Ukrainian nation. For many people, this is fine. I've talked to ethnic Russians who now embrace aspects of ethnic Ukrainian identity, such as speaking Ukrainian, or even accepting Stepan Bandera as a national hero. And they're comfortable absolutely leaving behind Russian ethnicity. However, there are other citizens, some Russian, some not, who find these elements alien to their experiences and concerns. More pointedly, is it possible that a Ukrainian civic identity is emerging that requires an anti-Russian worldview? Is it possible to be Ukrainian and hold pro-Russian views? If so, which pro-Russian views are acceptable and which are not? I think that these are open questions in the current climate in Ukraine. In Ukraine, there exists substantial and ongoing attitudinal divides within the population on major issues such as Ukraine's foreign policy orientation, language, history, federalization, etc. And political division, as we well know, generally runs along an east-west regional axis. With the establishment of the pro-Russian DNR and LNR in the eastern region of Donbass, the question arises, given the relatively greater number of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in Donbass, did ethnic affiliation play a central role in bringing Ukraine's regional divide to a head? And more broadly, does ethnic affiliation determine shared political attitudes or even a common worldview? We should, I argue, be very cautious about conflating regional polarization of political attitudes with ethnic identity, and cautious about assuming that ethnicity determines a common worldview or directly determines political attitudes. First of all, there's huge variation in attitudes across Ukraine's eastern and southern regions, where ethnic Russians live in concentrated numbers. But also, there's enormous variation within particular regions, including within Donbass, where only some of the population supported separatism. And there's even variation in the reasons for that support, not all of which was driven by a desire to join Russia. So yes, attitudes in support of Russia are more commonly found among ethnic Russians in the east and south. But we actually know less about the political attitudes of ordinary Ukrainians than is generally recognized. We know little about how local context and local interest inform so-called pro-Russian attitudes. A citizen who supports Putin's annexation of Crimea is clearly expressing pro-Russian attitudes. But what about a person who defends his or her right to continue to visit relatives living over the border in Russia? Is that a pro-Russian attitude? Or the trader who commutes across the border to import retail goods from Russia to Ukraine and wants to continue to do so? So here's a list of some very different interests or attitudes or motivations that could be considered pro-Russian. For example, an oligarch who supports continuing trade relations with Russia, or in general, I mentioned the trader, pragmatic support for continued economic trade and integration. Or what about cultural identification with Russia, but rejection of Russia's current politics, much in the way that researchers have identified younger ethnic Russians in Latvia identifying with Russian culture, but opposing Putin's policies. Another type of what we generally label pro-Russian would be the right to continue to speak Russian in Ukraine. Or it could mean identification with the Soviet past or nostalgia for the Soviet Union, as has been identified as one of the motivations for supporting the DNR and LNR. It could mean a desire for higher monthly pensions, as some residents of Crimea hoped they would receive by voting to separate from Russia. So clearly, people have very different motivations for maintaining positions that advocate continued engagement with Russia. If Ukrainian national identity comes to include, by definition, a rejection of engagement with Russia, it will likely alienate many Ukrainian citizens of varied ethnicities, backgrounds, and interests. So political leaders and opinion leaders in Ukraine, as well as ordinary citizens, should be on guard against thinking and acting in ethnic binaries or in political binaries that can lead to exclusion othering, and alienation of large segments of the Ukrainian population. Thank you.